There's a type of answer that someone gives when their allegiance is to the truth that they need to be true. And there's a type of answer that people who are actually interested in the truth give.
Rhett of Rhett and Link recently sat down with Alex O'Connor and told the story of his deconstruction from his Christian faith. His faith unraveled, beginning with questions around evolution, which led to doubts about Jesus. But there's an interesting thread that travels through the entire conversation that I want to zoom in on because it illustrates a very important point about deconstruction. So it's summed up right here.
Never considering that, well, maybe there's a few more ways to think about these things.
Do you think there's pride in there? I mean, one of the worst sins a Christian can commit is the sin of pride. And I think they're constantly sort of battling against it, especially when you're in a position, I mean, let alone some of the people I talk to who have public platforms, constantly putting themselves in front of a microphone and answering people's questions and being constantly praised. It must be really difficult to not get prideful when it starts working. But even in an outreach situation like this, is there an element where it's sort of like, not like I'm better than these people, but like, look at me doing this good thing, walking into the depths of hell and harrowing it and getting everyone, back to Christ?
Yes. I mean, I think that there's an element of sort of taking pride in the work that you're doing for God, even though you can easily give God the credit, be like, the Spirit was working through me. Because if you know the code of humility and you know how to talk about these things, but secretly you're thinking about how you're doing in relation to other Christians, and you're thinking about how they're doing in relation to you. Yeah. You can't, it's human nature. You're gonna do that. But I think there's another type of pride that I think back on those times. I remember a specific instance, and this is actually after I was no longer on staff with Campus Crusade, but I was still very active in the church, and I was leading a Bible study. Mm-hmm. And we had become friends with this couple that were Catholic, and in my estimation, Catholics weren't Christians. I mean, I was that type of evangelical.
Whoa, yeah. Really?
I was like, well, maybe there's some that actually have a relationship with Jesus,
idolaters, worshiping
Mary. But they believe, they believe that it's works and faith. It's not just faith alone, sure. And so they don't have the grace thing figured out. At the very least, I need to introduce them to the real truth, right? Mm-hmm. And so I knew they were going to be there. And so I was like, well, I'm going to do a Bible study. I'm going to go from Galatians, right? Because Galatians talks about that,
It does. And at our church, we just started a study of the book of Galatians, and it does talk about that. And it was kind of a root system of the Protestant Reformation, interestingly enough.
Basically, how it's about faith and and not about works. And it was one of those things that, in retrospect, I was thinking about them, and everyone else in the Bible study, the other regulars, knew that I was kind of preaching to them from this perspective. And I think back on that, and I'm like, I brought a lot of spiritual pride to that situation because I thought I had the correct perspective and just assumed they don't agree with me about this, and they're definitely wrong. I'm bringing them in to give them the truth. When you think that you've got the truth, and it's a truth that impacts everyone, it applies to everyone, it's really difficult to not take pride in that and to begin to see yourself as better. I mean, I'm not saying that all Christians think that they're better than other people. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying for me,
your experience,
I remember lying there when I was in college and thinking how grateful I was that I basically believed the right thing about everything.
Yeah, well, I often parody Christian denominations with that exact thought. It's like, right. What are the odds? How lucky you are.
And with no irony at all. Of course, I was, a 20-year-old kid, but I was lying there in bed and I was like, man, not only am I a Christian, but I am the right kind of Christian. Like, I believe the right stuff. I'm in the right denomination. I'm in the right ministry. Like, even amongst the ministries here on campus, I'm in the one that is the most serious about this. Yeah. And I was like, I'm so thankful that I'm right about everything. Essentially is what I was saying.
Yeah, those are my nightly affirmations too. I'm just so grateful for being right about everything. It's fascinating. There is an interesting paradox there, the so-called Preface Paradox, where...
By the way, this is kind of the root system thing that I want to get into here, and he has a great little illustration of what this actually is.
where people they can think that they're right about everything whilst also thinking they're wrong about at least one thing. It's called the Preface Paradox because at the beginning of a book, authors will often say, if there are any mistakes in here, like, I'm sorry. But they've gone through meticulously and checked every single one. So
Right.
if I went through every single one of your beliefs individually and said, do you think this is true? Yes. Do you think this is true? Yes. Because I'm going through your beliefs. So definitionally, every one of them
Right.
would say yes. But if at the end I then say, but do you think at least one of those beliefs is actually false? If you're a bit humble in any respect, you go, yeah, of course, one of them's false.
Yeah.
So you've got this paradox of thinking they're all true, but at least one of them's false. It's got to do with like probabilistic
Right.
certainty, probably.
Well, and we need to keep in mind, this is the kind of thing I want to zoom out on the most, and this was threaded throughout because I've heard this in different versions of this have come up, that Christians have been criticized for being arrogant, that they know the truth and other people do not. And on one hand, I get that, I understand that, but on the other hand, the two people that are having this conversation fall in those same categories, just from a different angle. Because in some sense, the preface paradox, that's true of everyone, whether you're irreligious or religious or whatever you are. You think you're right about certain things, and you think that you understand the truth about stuff. That's why they're having this conversation. Rhett moved from, he thought he was right, and now he knows he was probably wrong, and now he believes he's right about that thing that he used to believe in. In other words, he shifted over that somewhere in there he really does believe he is correct, and that's an unavoidable thing, and that comes out in Rhett's next statement.
But yeah, there's that feeling that you've got God on your side as well, and you sort of go to sleep slightly prideful, slightly content, slightly happy. Where does that certainty come from? Was it the result of Bible study and consideration of different groups and denominations? Was it more sociological, just sort of the way you were brought up? Were you cognizant of the factors which led you to be in the correct denomination and the correct student group?
Yeah, so not at the time. I think that what I would have said is that I had been taught the right stuff from my parents, and I had been in the right environment growing up. I think that ultimately there's a few factors that contributed to it. I think number one, certainty is a really important aspect of religious faith, and especially Christianity, and especially evangelical Christianity, because I think that agreeing with a set of propositional statements is actually if you ask somebody to describe, they might say, well, it's about a relationship with Jesus. But if you're like, well, yeah, but what does that mean? These propositional statements come up. It's like, well, I believe this about Jesus. If any church worth its salt has a "we believe" place on their website, right? That's what I thought, right?
But there's a reason why, because those are descriptions of what we perceive to be reality. And again, certainty, they say certainty is very important for religious people. Well, it's important for everybody. So let me ask you a few questions. Think about this, because anybody has a propositional truth kind of thing going inside of them. You could write your own propositional truth statement out of your own beliefs, no matter where your beliefs are. Do you, for instance, do you believe that your senses are essentially reliable in interpreting the world? Some people believe that, some people don't. I believe if you say yes, that is your confident belief about reality. Do you believe that there are moral categories that all people are accountable to? If you believe that's true, which a lot of people do, and they certainly act like they do, then that is something you believe. What do you believe about life after death? Do you believe there's a conscious existence after death? Well, some people feel very strongly about that, others don't. But all propositional statements are just saying, these things I really do believe because I think they are real, and they acquire definition. I want to go on to the next thing, because he says something that's kind of along the same lines, but it has to do with science and evolution and how that affected him when it comes to this whole search for truth.
That's when it started dawning on me that, okay, I began to notice a pattern, and I think maybe I didn't even realize I was noticing a pattern yet, but this is the pattern that started then and then propagated itself throughout my entire deconstruction. And that is, there's a type of answer that someone gives when their allegiance is to the truth that they need to be true. And there's a type of answer that people who are actually interested in the truth give. And what I kept finding is that Christian apologetics, really consists of people who are like, well, the truth cannot be questioned. The truth, we've predetermined that this is true. And now we've got to find a way to buttress that truth. And there's a tenor to those arguments that they don't hold up very well under scrutiny. When you get the answer to the answer to the answer to the answer, you just keep finding that, it just seems like these people seem to be interested in what actually happened, and these people seem to be interested in the truth that they hope that happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's a valid point in many respects, and can't argue that too much, except for, I will always say about deconstruction. Deconstruct your deconstruction, the thinking that you're assuming going in. And this is a very good example, because I promise you that's not just true of Christian apologetics. Evolution, I found, is very guilty of that. And let me give you a couple of names. The first one is Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson was a Harvard undergrad graduate. He got his law degree from the University of Chicago. He was a UC Berkeley law professor, and he clerked for the Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren. So this guy really knows his stuff as far as legal things and all that. His expertise was in the area of evidence. And he wrote a book called Darwin on Trial, because he just got interested. And you read the book, he says, I was interested, I didn't know a lot about biology, but I do know a lot about arguments. I do know a lot about consistency of evidence and how it's presented. And so he went out and he asked, give me the best information you have on evolutionary theory. And he went through and said, this is a strong argument over here, but this one seems like it has logical holes, and there's not as much evidence as you think, just as an evidentiary expert, right? So he goes on a bunch of debates, he's on radio shows and everything, and he writes a follow-up book called Reason and the Balance, because what he discovered is something I've discovered, and I promise you is still real. Anytime you question evolutionary theory commonly understood, the argument is typically not answered, and that's what he found. They wouldn't kind of engage with him on the actual argument that he was setting up. They just simply said, you're doing religion, we're doing science. This is admitted here's the other name I want to give you. There's a guy named Thomas Nagel. He is a philosopher out of New York University. He wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, and the subtitle is Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And he says this, quote, I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Point being that everybody ends up adopting a philosophy that they do protect and that they are going to naturally defend in light of things. To give an example of this, we did a video about Darwinism, and there's a Christian and a lapsed Jew and kind of a heterodox atheist talking about this and questioning it. And predictably, most people would probably say they're just trying to do religion instead of science. And that's the protectionism going on. Hope that helps. See you next time.